April 26th, 2019. On this day, I'm sure a decent number of you were at the movie theater, watching Avengers Endgame, one of the most beloved and uniting cultural artifacts of the last few decades. I remember sitting in that theater on opening day, sharing in everybody's joy with the film's endless list of memorable moments. It's hard to pick just one singular favorite moment when there are so many peak moments, but I do have one. It's not Captain America picking up Mjolnir or when all the characters come through the portals. It's actually a brief moment when Hulk is discussing time travel with Ant-Man and War Machine. The assumption that Ant-Man and War Machine have is that actual time travel works the way that it does in most popular movies, like a river going in one direction. They believe that if they went back in time and killed their arch-nemesis, Thanos, when he was a child, that would prevent him from killing half of life in the universe. Hulk then dispels this notion, saying that if Ant-Man went into the past, that past becomes his future, and his former present becomes the past, which cannot be changed by his new future.
So Back to the Future is a bunch of bullshit.
This is my favorite scene because in a movie that's all about generally mindless excitement, it was the one scene that made me reflect. Yeah, I knew there were multiple interpretations of what time travel could look like, but I just sort of unconsciously accepted that the single river interpretation of time was correct, because that's the interpretation I had encountered most of my life. At the time, it made me want to seek out a piece of media that represented time travel as accurately as possible, at least to our current knowledge of theoretical physics. But I quickly gave up because of how pervasive the single river interpretation was. However, I was recently reminded of this pursuit because I encountered a piece of media that has, by far, my favorite representation of time travel: Steins Gate. Now, I already know what some of you pre-existing fans of Steins Gate are thinking. You're like, wait, Max, you're not about to say that an anime where a guy uses a cell phone and a microwave to travel back in time is the most accurate, are you? Well, yes, but no, but look, that side of it is obviously beyond ridiculous, but there is something to be said about the theories underlying this version of time travel. Believe it or not, Steins Gate's version of time travel is grounded in some of the best research on the subject that humanity has produced, which is then used to, miraculously, make its ridiculous method feel real. What if we could produce a rotating black hole that we could use to send bite-sized information into the past, or to a parallel dimension? Yeah, maybe we couldn't do it with a cell phone and a microwave, but what if there was a way to do it? I'm sure there are plenty of other forms of media that do a better job connecting the speculative and the established science of theoretical time travel, but I have a hard time believing they managed to do that while connecting it to a story filled with universally likable characters and witty dialogue. Most importantly, though, I have a hard time believing that there's another story that does this while also contending with the philosophical implications of time travel. People in my audience recommended Steins Gate to me because of its existential narrative. While there are the typical existential themes you would expect in Japanese media, like fate versus free will, there's an even deeper element that nobody in the Steins Gate fan community seems to have picked up on. It has to do with its invocation of Martin Heidegger's philosophy. I found that by applying his theory to Steins Gate, the story evolved from something brilliant to something groundbreaking in the truest sense of the word. I've already spent enough time setting things up, so let's just jump into why Steins Gate is a Heideggerian masterpiece. First, obviously, I need to summarize Heidegger's philosophy for the newcomers. This will be difficult because Heidegger's genius lies in his detail, and that detail is more easily expressed in his native German language. Nonetheless, I believe I've concocted a summary which is adequate for this analysis. In very rough terms, Heidegger wanted to do away with a priori assumptions in philosophy. I already lost you, didn't I? Okay, let's try again. I'm sure at some point in your life you've heard the philosophical phrase, "I think, therefore I am," a phrase coined by the 17th century philosopher René Descartes. He said this because he believed that if everything in life could be argued to be an illusion, the one thing that he could be certain of is that he existed, and his existence was confirmed by his ability to think. It was from this notion that the philosophy of the Enlightenment era began to flourish and influence so much of the way we think today, what we can roughly call modern philosophy. Now, in the 19th and 20th centuries, we had postmodern philosophers that came along and challenged fundamental notions like "I think, therefore I am." Most famously, the 19th century postmodernist Friedrich Nietzsche challenged the existence of I as we understood it, as our ego. How do we know for sure that our sense of I/ego isn't an illusion? Are we the source of our ideas, or are we controlled by unconscious forces that we don't understand? Maybe it would be more accurate to say something is thinking, rather than I. Then Heidegger comes along in the 20th century and continues this line of skepticism. He wanted to not do away with, but temporarily put modernist Enlightenment-era philosophy to the side. By doing this, one could try to understand what it fundamentally means to be, in the hopes that one could develop a more universal philosophy and, ideally, discover the true meaning of life. Heidegger, most famously, invented a philosophical term to describe this uncontaminated examination of existence, Dasein, which literally translates to being there. So, what were Heidegger's conclusions about Dasein, about what it truly means to be? To begin, I will quote the 2 times that Heidegger is mentioned in Steins Gate. The first time, the character Makise Kurisu quotes him.
人間は根源的に時間的存在である。ハイデガーの言葉よ。
The second time Heidegger is referenced, in the Japanese subbed version, the character Rentaro Okabe repeats what Kurisu says. However, the English dub gets closer to what Heidegger meant by the phrase.
Human beings are time-haunted. That's what Heidegger thought, isn't it?
Time-haunted is more accurate than temporal because Heidegger believed humans were universally anxious about death, a state that fundamentally motivated our actions and philosophy. That is one key aspect of Dasein. Another key aspect is what our response should be to our time-hauntedness, which Heidegger felt was the most fundamental part of life. That is, to be with. In doing so, one could find ways to care for, to love one another in the face of our impending death. Quote, "So far as Dasein is at all, it has being with one another as its kind of being." Now, if we accept Heidegger's proposition that life, fundamentally, means to care for one another, then the question becomes, how do we live the best, most caring life? Well, simply, we must use our consciousness, the thing that distinguishes us from any other living being, to reflect on how we can facilitate the best form of care for ourselves and others, the best form of Dasein. Not only would doing this help us survive, but it would also help us become more conscious, authentic individuals. This would put us in contrast to what Heidegger would call the inauthentic masses, those who do their best to remain unconscious of their impending death. For doing so would mean taking on the enormous responsibility of figuring out the best way to care for ourselves and others. But those who accept that responsibility, those who step back and reflect on their thoughts and beliefs, like Ant-Man, one would eventually embody Dasein and be an archetype worthy of emulation. Now, how does Steins Gate make use of Heideggerian philosophy in a way that makes it, as I said before, groundbreaking? It takes Heidegger's notion of Dasein and contemplates how it would work if the rules of time, as we currently understand them, did not apply. What if we weren't time-haunted? What if we could continuously go back in time, traveling to parallel dimensions in attempts to alter our fate. What effect would that have on, for lack of a better word, the soul? Steins Gate stews in those possibilities, often breaking its characters with the worst-case scenarios, but just as often showing the human will to overcome those worst-case scenarios, demonstrating that it is possible to embody Dasein when the rules of time and fate work against us. Though there are multiple examples in the series of characters struggling with living authentically, I will focus on the most obvious example, Rintaro Okabe and his love for his sister figure Mayuri. For the first 12 episodes of the 24-episode anime, Okabe, a self-proclaimed mad scientist, performs multiple experiments to determine to what extent he can use his cell phone and microwave to influence the past. In short, he combines the receivers of the cell phone with the nodes of a microwave to generate small spinning black holes, which are able to open small enough holes in space-time to send data the size of a text message back to the past. See what I mean about making the ridiculous sound grounded and scientific? Anyway, though these messages do go back in time and influence the present, it bears repeating what Hulk said before, that time isn't like a river. When Okabe sends a message back in time, his consciousness is shifted to a parallel universe, or what the anime refers to as a world line. He experiments with time travel for roughly 12 episodes, eventually getting to the point where he can send his own consciousness back a few hours. However, a secret organization known as CERN catches wind of Okabe's experiments. Like Okabe, they too have been conducting experiments with time travel, but with the added intent of achieving world domination. Due to the fact that their attempts have failed where Okabe's have succeeded, they wish to steal his technology and eventually kill him and all of his assistants. In episode 12, they execute a raid on Okabe's lab, and tragically, his aforementioned sister figure, Mayuri, is shot to death. Before he suffers the same fate, he manages to send his consciousness back in time, enabling him to try and find a way to, hopefully, send his consciousness to a world line where Mayuri survives. Now before I return to the topic of Dasein, I need to briefly give some attention to the way that Mayuri is written and her relationship to Okabe. The first time Mayuri was introduced, I knew immediately she was going to die. The anime was just doing too much to endear her to you, with her childlike demeanor, her love for cosplay, and her constant doo-doo-doo. Yeah, remember when John Wick's dog got killed, and everybody watching that movie said, okay, these motherfuckers gotta die? When Mayuri gets killed, the anime wants you to be willing to start World War III to avenge her death. And it's not just because of her lovable personality, it's also because of her importance to Okabe. Mayuri seems to be the only person that Okabe has any deep connection with at the beginning of the anime. This is likely because she is the only person we know that is able to platonically love Okabe despite his eccentric, grandiose personality. A personality that everybody else in the anime is repulsed by. Due to this, it was easy for Okabe to reciprocate Mayuri's love, which he has been doing for at least 2/3 of his life. As the anime slowly establishes this relationship, it is made clear that Okabe simply cannot live without Mayuri. So when she dies, the only possible option available to both Okabe and the audience is to save her. However, as I hinted at before, the way time travel complicates proper Dasein renders Okabe's mission one of great philosophical and emotional difficulty. After Okabe tries to save Mayuri the first time, he fails, partially because he is only able to send his consciousness back in time a very short period. However, the primary reason for his failure slowly reveals itself the more Okabe goes back in time and tries to save Mayuri. No matter what he does, the mechanisms of fate always seem to surface, and cause Mayuri to die anyway. Naturally, these persistent failures are enough to make Okabe consider whether Mayuri's death is the will of fate. But rather than contend with the possibility, he pushes it out of his mind and puts himself through hell again and again to save his reason for living. Now, one could argue that the depth of Okabe's love for Mayuri and the lengths he's going to represent a form of ideal Dasein. He cares so much for her and has relied so much on her that he is willing to try and surmount the unsurmountable. His fate and her fate. Moreover, it is through trying to save Mayuri that his previous mad scientist persona begins to sunder, or more appropriately, he begins to embody the Japanese concept of tsundere, where a character's personality evolves from something harsh into something more ideal. In other words, his attempts to defeat fate are making him a more authentic person. One where others, especially the character Kurisu, begin to love him and play a large part in supporting Okabe's quest. That said, one could also argue that the effects of time travel negate proper Dasein. If Okabe sends his consciousness back in time again and again, which we are led to believe he would do ad infinitum for Mayuri, then the concept of death loses its meaning. Okabe refers to this reality in one of the most heartbreaking moments in the show. In episode 22, he confides to Kurisu that he no longer feels anything when watching Mayuri die, because he's watched her die so many times, an admittance that makes Kurisu slap him across the face. On top of this, it should be questioned how this problem would apply to Okabe personally, or anybody that would use time travel so they would not suffer a loss. Theoretically, neither Okabe nor any other would-be time traveler would die. But is that so desirable? How would the lack of death anxiety, the lack of time-hauntedness influence life and its meaning? Would time travel necessarily make proper Dasein impossible? After all, it is the fact that people die that confers at least some of their specialness. Ironically, to quote the character Vision from another Avengers movie, a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts. So this begs the question, even if we don't want to admit it, would it be better to let Mayuri die so the beauty and meaning of her existence would be preserved? Would it be better for Okabe's personal health to accept the mechanisms of fate, as fatalists and some determinists might? Personally, I think the majority of people watching Steins Gate would do as Okabe did. Tear themselves to shreds, trying to save the one they love, the one they need, even if it was in vain. Think about it. If you were in Okabe's shoes, and you accepted fate, would you be able to move on? Or would we be like the character of Kiryu Moeka, whose entire life depended on the mysterious character known as FB? Or the character of Susaha Amane, whose life's meaning rested on the completion of her mission? Would Okabe end up like them? Would his fate be his self-termination? I think most people would agree that not only would that not make for a good story, it would mean that some humans would be doomed from birth to a needlessly cruel fate. I think most people would say that it would be better to die trying. This is all reminiscent of the Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky's brilliant insight into the debate over free will versus fate/determinism. Even if it could be proven that we had no free will, that we were akin to keys on a piano being pushed by the whims of fate, human beings would contrive the most chaotic and unimaginable things to try and dispute that proof. In a non-chaotic way though, Okabe slowly represents the best version of this human will. He stands back and tries to change the factors of each world line that led to Mayuri's death. Though doing so tangibly chips away at his emotional stability, he does make tangible progress towards his goal, despite new and increasingly difficult challenges. The worst challenge comes toward the end, when Okabe seems forced by fate to choose between letting Mayuri live and Kurisu, a character who slowly helped him become a better man, die. Or choose the reverse, where Kurisu lives and Mayuri dies. Even in that circumstance, he tries to find a third option, no matter how impossible it may seem to accomplish. Yet, he has faith that his will and his love were strong enough to transcend even fate. And, at least with the ending of the anime, he eventually embodies Heidegger's Dasein.